The first time Julian realized his absolute power was gone, he wasn't standing in a courtroom, he wasn't holding termination papers, and he certainly wasn't mourning the end of his career. He was strutting through the grand lobby of Vanguard Tower, laughing confidently, blissfully unaware that the foundation of his stolen wealth was about to collapse. He adjusted his designer suit, expecting the usual obedience from the staff. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I wasn't just a bystander in his downfall. I was his cousin, the family's lead architect, and the designated scapegoat for every failure Vanguard Estates ever produced. The scene at Vanguard Tower that morning was just the climax of a disease that had infected our family for years. The true diagnosis began the night before, at the elite charity gala hosted at the Drake in Chicago. The chandeliers cast a heavy golden glow over the ballroom, illuminating the crystal champagne flutes and the polished smiles of the city's wealthiest real estate developers. I stood near the edge of the room in a simple navy dress, an outsider in my own bloodline, watching the elite sip their champagne. Camilla, my aunt and the mastermind behind the company's daily operations, cornered me near the grand ice sculpture. Julian flanked her, adjusting his designer cuffs with an air of profound entitlement. They didn't come to discuss architecture or the charitable foundation. They came to deliver an invoice, $500,000. That was the exact cost of a catastrophic structural liability Julian had caused on our newest downtown high-rise project by cutting corners with cheap steel suppliers. But Julian wasn't going to take the blame. Vanguard Estates needed its heir to look flawless for the shareholders. Camilla handed me the formal liability acknowledgement documents, witnessed by the company's internal counsel standing silently behind her, a pen already uncapped. I looked at the paper, absorbing the cold arithmetic of my family's betrayal. This was the psychological trap of their relentless normalization of cruelty. Abusive family systems do not succeed through overt, explosive violence. They thrive by disguising exploitation as mundane familial duty. They frame your compliance as a moral obligation, turning your bank account and your professional reputation into a corporate utility player. For years, I had been the silent, uncredited investor in their version of family. I designed the award-winning facades. I drafted the complex blueprints late into the night, and I watched Julian take the credit in every glowing press release. I stood there, the heavy silver pen resting in my fingers, calculating the true cost of refusal. Why does the scapegoat stay silent for so long? It is the invisible chain of the survivor. When you are conditioned from childhood to believe that your only value lies in what you can absorb for others, staying silent feels like the only way to maintain the subscription to their affection. You trade your dignity for a seat at the table, convincing yourself that if you just carry one more burden, they will finally see your worth. But love is not a contract where you continuously foot the bill for their careless mistakes. I did not cry. I did not ask why. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. I had spent a decade designing structural foundations that could withstand Category 5 hurricanes. Yet I had allowed my own boundaries to collapse under the weight of their profound entitlement. As the elite conversed around me, completely blind to the transaction occurring in their midst, I looked at Camilla's expectant face and Julian's smug, untouchable smile. They were waiting for me to sign away $500,000. They weren't shocked by what they were doing. They expected it. I took the pen. I signed my name in sharp, decisive strokes. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. The transaction was complete, but the accounting had just begun. The ink on the $500,000 liability transfer was barely dry when the gala doors opened, and a hushed, frantic whisper rippled through the crowded ballroom. Marcus, my grandfather's longtime executive assistant, walked straight through the sea of evening gowns and tuxedos toward Camilla. His face was a mask of professional stoicism, but his eyes carried the heavy weight of an era ending. Arthur Vanguard, the ruthless founder of Vanguard Estates and the only true architect of our family's wealth, had just passed away. There was no wailing. There was no desperate grasping for comfort or shared grief. In the Vanguard family, Grief was just another variable in the market, a shift in the corporate weather. Camilla did not shed a single tear for her father. She immediately pivoted to Julian, her voice dropping to a rapid, calculating whisper. They were already dividing the empire in their minds. I watched them mentally tally their inheritance shares, carving up my grandfather's legacy before his body was even cold. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a shred of regret for the grandfather who had remained a distant, intimidating figure my entire life, but there was only clarity. Before Camilla could even pull out her phone to dial her wealth manager, Marcus stepped aside, allowing Arthur's longtime legal counsel to approach our small, tense circle. The lawyer did not offer gentle condolences or sympathetic platitudes. He offered a heavy, leather-bound portfolio. Camilla reached for it instinctively, assuming her position as the new matriarch, but the lawyer bypassed her outstretched hand entirely. He handed the portfolio directly to me. Camilla's polished facade slipped, her smile vanishing into a tight line of confusion. She demanded to know what was going on, her tone sharp and authoritative. The lawyer's voice was crisp and devoid of emotion, echoing the clinical reality of the moment. Hours before his death, Arthur Vanguard had executed an updated, ironclad, irrevocable living trust. It included multiple biometric verifications, unassailable psychological assessments, and recorded video testimony. It was indisputable. The core controlling assets of Vanguard Estates, the voting shares, the prime commercial properties, and the central trust, they were not going to Camilla. They were not going to Julian. The absolute trusteeship and beneficiary rights were transferred immediately and irrevocably to me. The sudden panic that seized my aunt and cousin was a masterpiece of corporate terror. Julian's face drained of color, his smugness evaporating into raw fear. Camilla stammered, demanding to see the documents, insisting it was a clerical mistake, a temporary lapse in her father's mental judgment. But the legal documents were flawless. The shift in power was absolute and instantaneous. They weren't mourning Arthur Vanguard. They were mourning their lost access to his capital. For my entire life, I had been an employee, a scapegoat, a buffer for their endless liabilities. Now, with a single stroke of a pen from a dying man, I was their majority shareholder. I did not gloat. I simply looked at the heavy documents resting in my hands. The power reversal was jarring, but I felt no triumphant rush. I had spent years subsidizing their luxury, footing the bill for their mistakes, and absorbing their failures. Now I owned the bank. I looked at Julian, who was suddenly gripping his champagne flute like a life preserver. I looked at Camilla, whose eyes were wide with the realization that her unchecked authority had just evaporated. The balance of power had shifted. The retaliation would be immediate. By 8 o'clock the following morning, I arrived at Arthur's grand estate in the northern suburbs. The sprawling stone mansion was completely silent, devoid of the usual bustling staff. Only Marcus was there, waiting for me by the heavy oak doors of my grandfather's private study. He did not offer empty platitudes or ask how I was feeling. He simply unlocked the door and guided me toward a hidden, fireproof vault set seamlessly into the rich mahogany paneling. Marcus input a complex sequence of codes. The heavy steel door clicked open, revealing rows of meticulously organized archival files. This was the silent regret of the gatekeeper. For the last 2 years, ever since his declining health forced him out of daily operations, Arthur Vanguard had watched his daughter and grandson systematically corrupt the empire he had built from the ground up. He was trapped between the primal, suffocating instinct of family loyalty and the cold, unyielding demand of corporate justice. He could not bring himself to destroy his own blood publicly while he lived, so he had spent his final years transforming his private study into a forensic arsenal. He had gathered the evidence, piece by isolated piece, waiting for the inevitable end, leaving the execution of justice to the only person who had ever actually worked for the firm. I pulled the primary ledger onto the heavy wooden desk and began reading. The numbers were absolutely staggering. It was not a simple case of mismanagement or poor investments. It was a massive, multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. For over 2 years, Camilla and Julian had been funneling corporate capital through a complex network of dummy consulting firms. They had authorized the illicit transfers using Arthur's forged digital credentials, all under Camilla's direct executive oversight. They had siphoned away the company's operational lifeblood to fund private jets, luxury vacations to tropical islands, and the artificial status they so desperately craved. But the financial theft was not the most lethal discovery. Beneath the thick ledgers lay a secondary red-tabbed file. I opened it, and the clinical detachment I had maintained began to harden into absolute ice. It was a meticulously drafted exit strategy, prepared by the family's external counsel. Camilla and Julian knew the embezzlement would eventually trigger a massive federal audit. To protect their stolen wealth, they had designed a legal framework to frame me. Upon inheriting the operational debt, my signature on the recent $500,000 liability transfer would serve as the keystone to their narrative. I was to be their criminal liability shield. They fully intended to send me to federal prison so they could walk away clean and keep the stolen millions. Love had never been a factor in our family dynamics, but this level of predatory calculation was breathtaking. I had been their subscription service, their utility, and finally, their intended sacrificial lamb. I looked up at Marcus. He stood perfectly still, a silent, unwavering witness to the unearthing of my family's rotting core. There was no hesitation. There was no tearful breakdown. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I simply took out my phone and dialed my brother Daniel. He was a ruthless corporate restructuring attorney who specialized in tearing down fraudulent empires. The time for silent endurance was over. The accounting was about to begin. Daniel arrived at the downtown office within 20 minutes. We did not exchange warm pleasantries. We did not discuss our grandfather's funeral arrangements. We laid the archival files across the massive glass conference table and went directly to work. Moving with absolute precision, we drafted the legal offensive. Daniel operated with the same cold, methodical efficiency that I applied to structural engineering. By 10:15 in the morning, the emergency injunctions were officially filed. We executed a sweeping, merciless freeze on every single personal and corporate account linked to Camilla and Julian. We locked down the trust funds, the offshore consulting accounts, the operational credit lines, and their heavily inflated personal wealth management portfolios. The financial lifeblood they had stolen was instantly cauterized. At the exact same time, Vanguard Estates was in the middle of preparing for a critical institutional fundraising round. Daniel bypassed the internal communications entirely and forwarded the preliminary forensic findings straight to the lead underwriters. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The massive fundraising round screeched to a violent halt. Lenders, panicked by the sudden volatility and the scent of fraud, began demanding immediate ownership disclosures, emergency audit clarifications, and a total halt on all outgoing capital. I sat at the head of the conference table, watching the digital confirmation notices roll in on my laptop. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I just opened my screen and watched the cancellations process. The elaborate architecture of their fake empire was crumbling under the weight of basic legal reality. I didn't feel a rush of dramatic vengeance. I felt the steady, reassuring click of a balance sheet, finally aligning. At 1:30 in the afternoon, the heavy glass doors to the executive suite rattled violently. Julian was attempting to storm my office. His face was flushed crimson with panic and absolute fury. His usually impeccable designer suit rumpled. He shouted my name, demanding access, demanding I reverse the asset freezes immediately, demanding I remember that we were family. He slammed his fist against the reinforced glass. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I simply watched him from my chair as the building's private security detail, flanked by two of Daniel's formidable associates, intercepted him. They blocked his path, physically separating him from the door. Julian tried to leverage his fading authority, screaming that he was the vice president of operations, that he essentially owned the building. But authority is a purely transactional concept, and his account was severely overdrawn. The security guards, having already been briefed on the ownership transfer, informed him coldly that his access badge had been permanently revoked. Julian locked eyes with me through the thick glass. He was waiting for me to falter, waiting for the compliant, silent cousin to step in and save him from his own actions. I merely picked up my pen and went back to reviewing the audit reports. He wasn't shocked by his own fraudulent actions. He was shocked that I had stopped playing along. The security team escorted him backward into the elevator. The executive lobby fell silent again. The preliminary strike was complete, and the board of directors was next. The emergency board meeting was convened at Vanguard Tower precisely at 4 o'clock that afternoon. The boardroom, a vast expanse of polished marble and panoramic city views, was usually Camilla's absolute domain. She and Julian strode through the double mahogany doors with their heads held high, wearing the polished, impenetrable armor of elite confidence. They genuinely believed they could bully the directors into submission, just as they had bullied and manipulated me for decades. They took their seats, ready to launch into a heavily practiced narrative about my supposed emotional instability and the temporary, tragic misunderstanding of my grandfather's trust. But the room was dead silent. Every single board member sat rigidly, staring down at the thick, red-tabbed folders resting in front of them. Daniel had ensured that the complete forensic audit report was hand-delivered to each director a full hour before the meeting began. I stood at the head of the table. I did not offer a polite greeting. I picked up a remote and activated the main presentation screen. The large display lit up, projecting the unassailable truth. It wasn't just bank statements and dummy corporations. We displayed the biometric security logs, meticulously cross-referenced with the operational timestamps. The raw data proved, irrefutably, that the fraudulent authorizations and the multi-million-dollar transfers were executed directly from Camilla's secure office terminal, using Arthur's forged credentials. The meticulous architecture of their massive fraud was laid bare for the entire board of directors to witness. Camilla stared at the high-definition screen, her impeccable posture fracturing before our eyes. She looked around the long table, desperately searching for an ally, a sympathizer, someone who would prioritize the prestigious Vanguard name over blatant federal crimes. She found only cold, evaluating stares. Cornered and completely stripped of her leverage, Camilla suffered a total, catastrophic public meltdown. She slammed her perfectly manicured hands onto the marble table, her voice escalating into a hysterical, piercing scream. She shrieked that she had carried the company on her back, that Arthur had lost his mind in his final years, that she had earned every single cent of that money. She pointed a trembling finger at me, the high-resolution security cameras in the corner of the boardroom recording every frantic movement. She accused me of stealing the family birthright, of manipulating a dying man, of being an ungrateful, pathetic parasite. Her unhinged outburst was clinical evidence of her own guilt. She didn't deny the theft. She merely defended her profound entitlement to it. I let her scream. I let the echoes of her entitlement bounce off the glass walls. When she finally ran out of breath, gasping and red-faced, the lead director simply cleared his throat. He called for an immediate vote. It was swift and merciless. The board voted unanimously. Camilla and Julian were immediately suspended from all corporate duties, stripped of their executive privileges, and barred from entering any Vanguard property pending a full federal investigation. Their corporate execution took exactly 12 minutes. I closed my laptop. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. 7 months later, the federal indictments were officially handed down. Camilla and Julian faced severe criminal charges for wire fraud, widespread embezzlement, and forgery. The aggressive asset forfeiture wiped out their hidden offshore accounts, their fleet of luxury vehicles, and their sprawling private estates. This is the ultimate illusion of an empty wallet. When your status is built entirely on stolen capital and superficial dominance, it possesses no actual structural integrity. The precise moment the money vanishes, the elite facade shimmers and completely collapses, leaving behind nothing but the hollow reality of who you truly are. They had constructed their entire lives on a foundation of sand, and the tide had finally come in to wash it all away. I stood alone on the balcony of my downtown office, the vast city skyline stretching out before me. The Vanguard name no longer represented corporate bullying and architectural theft. I had restructured the core trust to establish the Arthur Vanguard Fellowship, a massive, ongoing endowment designed to fully fund and elevate overlooked creators, the brilliant architects and engineers who were consistently pushed into the shadows by louder, more entitled voices. Justice is not merely the harsh punishment of the wicked. True justice is the active, relentless creation of a better future. It is taking the bitter seeds of a poisoned harvest and planting something that will genuinely nourish others. Julian requested a final meeting before his criminal trial began. I met him at a small riverside cafe. He looked incredibly diminished, the arrogant swagger completely replaced by a frantic, desperate, nervous energy. He slid a rolled-up piece of paper across the table. They were old childhood blueprints, naive designs we had sketched together when we were 10 years old, back before the money and the toxic family politics had corrupted absolutely everything. He was looking for mercy, hoping weaponized nostalgia would buy him a financial lifeline. I looked at the blueprints, then looked at him. I did not touch the paper. I calmly declined the offering, stood up, and walked away. My accounting with him was permanently closed. I've come to realize that forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. But forgiveness does not require maintaining a connection to the people who systematically broke you. To those of you listening, the ones who have always felt like you are standing on the periphery of your own lives, the designated scapegoats, the invisible laborers who carry the heavy weight of toxic systems, you do not have to endure the profound pain of not belonging to a table that was explicitly built to exploit you. You have the absolute right to stop paying the emotional debt of people who refuse to see your worth. Cutting ties with toxicity is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-respect. You have the power to walk away, to freeze the accounts on their emotional manipulation, and to design a life where your value is undeniable. Build your own foundation, protect your peace, and remember that the best response to those who try to make you small is to realize your own immense, unassailable power. If this story resonated with your own journey of finding strength and setting boundaries, hit that share button and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our community.